friends' houses, on the streets. And I've been going through a lot of these, and those answers have been repeated. So a lot about specific places in Berkeley or other cities or other urban areas where folks might congregate. And then there's definitely a few people who say everywhere, and a few people who say couch surfing or at friends' houses or in shelters.
So just beginning the conversation, what is invisible homelessness?
I'm sorry, the girl in that movie, in the video, who's living in her car is invisibly homeless. It's not a home exactly, having a car.
It's that and just that idea that because someone doesn't look a certain way, they're not homeless. So just being invisible in that sense.
I agree in a similar note. I was just going to say something around just instability for housing, like not necessarily having a long-term guarantee of where you're going to be able to sleep or live.
I was thinking more along the lines of choosing to ignore people that are homeless.
Like all homelessness kind of has this invisibility in a way. Interesting. Yeah.
It's a little different than what we're talking about, but when they opened the Rosie the Riveter Center out in Richmond, there was a woman selling a book that her mother had written during the war, or about her experience during World War II and homelessness, and it shocked me because I realized that my mother and I were homeless during World War II. My father was in the service, and we lived with friends and relatives, but we traveled around to different places for 2 years, and I had never even considered that I had ever been homeless. So you never know who or where.
Thank you. I was going to say thank you so much for that point too, because the question of visibility is like visible to whom? You know, is it even visible to the person who's experiencing it? You know, so.
Yeah, I agree with her because oftentimes, just because you're with relatives, people think that you have a house, but you really don't, because you don't have the keys, or you're just temporarily staying there. So technically, you're homeless. You don't have your own house. That's invisible to someone else.
Like, what do you think are the effects of invisible homelessness? And we can also talk about why homeless youth might be invisible in different ways. So why they're invisible, and what do you think are the effects of invisible homelessness?
Well, I think a lot of times when we talk about homelessness, it's not, usually young people, a lot of young people don't want to use that word. You know, it sounds like a label that we're giving to these young people. And, you know, they're doing this, they're doing that, they don't consider themselves homeless, or they're just like unstable. So I think that makes it a little bit more complex to talk about, because I think that kind of speaks to how difficult it is to serve this group, or why they're invisible. No one really wants to step up and be like, hey, guess what, I'm homeless.
Right, exactly. Survival mind, it totally depends on not doing that. And I think that that's totally something that we want to talk about too. And it's interesting because I feel like when I'm even phrasing that question, it's like it feels like I'm arguing for, you know, they're invisible, they should be visible homeless. When really it's like, oh, that's not that's not what we're trying to get to. But then there's also the tricky double-edged sword of like if folks are not visible to the ones providing resources or trying to serve, then that's a problem too. So I guess what we're trying to do, we don't have the answers to these questions. That's what this town hall is for, really, to have people with varying levels of expertise, experience, and questions in their rooms so we can talk this out with each other and kind of figure out where we end up on some of these thoughts. So yeah, so other reasons why folks might be invisible, problems with that phrasing, or yeah.
I just wanted to add, our organization is working with quite a few other organizations on the Homeless Bill of Rights. And that is a bill that's going, hopefully be on the ballot in November. So we've been lobbying for this bill for a while. But initially it started out as being the Homeless Person's Bill of Rights. We argued that for months and months and months. We took the persons out because now we're saying for people who are experiencing homelessness.
Across the board, it's a very kind of psychologically and emotionally unacceptable thing to be and or to be experiencing. And and they're across the board in general. This is a really big generalization, but I would say there's a general cultural many complications with homelessness as far as the general feeling that it's somebody's fault that they are homeless, or that they could get out of it themselves but choose not to, or a variety of things like that. That both makes people not want to be visible as homeless, but also makes people that don't know anything about homelessness sometimes not really want to think about it.
Well, one time I was at a meeting and we were talking about homelessness. It was very much like a town hall like this one. And the woman, she was like, you know, why would I want to be defined by something that I don't have? And I feel like it's just really applicable, and that's why it's so very damaging. Like the term homelessness, I think, is what creates the invisibility. Because, like, as you mentioned before, you wouldn't, like, there's very, like, much this mainstream image of what that is. And so even when, like, I was sleeping in my car, it's like I still wanted to get my nails done, or, like, things like that, where it's like I looked, like, clean and presentable. And so I feel like that also created invisibility, even though you would see me walking around the street. So just different, like the ways that, like, I don't know, if you like care about, you know, fitting in, or like being held to like different standards, you know, in terms of like if there's somebody who's chronically homeless for like 25 years and there's substance abuse and there's like mental abuse that's like all tangled up in that, then that's like a very different situation. And so that's why I think that it's important for like youth that are homeless versus the adult homeless population to be separated, like the same reason that we would have juvenile facilities versus like adult prisons, right? And so it's like you're really dealing with like two very different things, because you're dealing with like a youth culture, and like there's certain things, like even in my answer when it was like the 50 or like how many percent do you think like engage in like you know, drugs and alcohol, like my number is gonna be like 50 to 70%, but not because it's like homeless, because that's a part of youth culture anyway. So just like examining that and seeing how that is amplified with homelessness on top of it.
The youth that come to our shelter are 18 to 25, which is pretty much the same age range as the UC students. And except for perhaps like 20% of the youth, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. Because, well, UC is a very diverse place and people dress in many diverse ways. It's a great campus where you would really see the difference. And oftentimes I'll come into the shelter, I can't tell who's staff and who are youth. So another thing that I've noticed is that even when youth have virtually nothing, whatever they've got, there are some of them that will want to dress up to the nines, like the young man in the video. And you kind of look at the outfit and you say, you know, that looks like $300 or $400 there between the shoes and the sweatshirt and the whole thing. But come to understand that when you don't have anything, when you don't have a home, the self-esteem that it gives you to have nice clothes is very important.
We talked about using, well, actually building knowledge and information about the cause itself, like, and where that goes back into history. For example, when like using certain language when discussing a sensitive topic, like the history behind where these terms came up that might be offensive or might like be acceptable, and what they really mean, especially when like using that from the perspective of like people facing homelessness today, and also yeah, just making the point that like whenever there has been some sort of big movement in history, building knowledge was the foundation of that first before like making like direct action, because that actually can be a form of direct action, informing people.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, building that knowledge and information base is a form of action, and then also acting without that information can be a form of oppression.
Exactly.
So, thank you.
But also, I think that important to bring to the conversation is also the difference between how males and females experience homelessness. Because as a woman, just like the threat of rape is like a lot more real, or like domestic violence. Like there's been situations that I've been with like a partner that was like abusive to me, either mentally or physically, but it was because I felt like very dependent on that person given my situation. And just like already just like being in this like kind of culture of like, you know, the constant objectification and just like a lot of the self-esteem, like how bullying is so present. And then like the way that it really affects like young women and like already just being so vulnerable, it's like so much more amplified, and just especially when you're a youth, because you're already trying to find your identity and like who you are. And so I think that there is like a really distinct difference that often is kind of just like lump summed, and that it doesn't really get talked about in
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that brings to light so many different nuances and complexities within youth homelessness that we want to talk about. And gendered experiences of homelessness and trauma and these things that were brought up that are huge topics and huge influencers are something that we absolutely talk about all the time, and in future town halls we'll delve into much deeper. And I think that today we wanted to focus on this idea of invisibilization and also substance use and mental health, which is something that we're going to talk about right now using the last video. But keep these thoughts going, keep talking to each other, and we'll come back to these same ideas.